Harvey Weinstein nearly screwed up the Lord of the Rings movies before a single frame was shot. The Lord of the Rings War of Rohirrim hits theaters this weekend, so here are some things I bet you never knew about Peter Jackson's original Lord of the Rings trilogy. The story behind the Lord of the Rings starts in the early 1930s at the University of Oxford. A nearly 40-year-old J.R.R. Tolkien was serving as the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon while also pursuing his own creative writing endeavors. And one day when he was grading papers, a line of prose popped into his brain. He grabbed a blank piece of paper and wrote, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." By late 1932, Tolkien had finished the first draft of The Hobbit, and it was published in 1937. That same year, he started working on its sequel, The Lord of the Rings, eventually publishing its 3 volumes in 1954 and 1955. With more than 150 million copies sold, The Lord of the Rings would go on to be one of the best-selling books ever written. Over the decades, the film rights to the story passed through various hands. Rembrandt Films had them and then sold them to United Artists, who kept The Hobbit but sold The Lord of the Rings rights to Saul Zaentz at Fantasy Films. Zaentz would produce Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated adaptation of the first half of the Lord of the Rings books. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, 17-year-old Peter Jackson had not yet read the books at that point, but he heard about them, so he went and saw Bakshi's movie. He liked the first half of the film, but found the second half confusing and disjointed. But because the story ended on a cliffhanger, he was motivated to read the books to find out what happened, which kicked off his lifelong fandom. Peter Jackson would grow up to become a filmmaker, and in 1995, while finishing The Frighteners, he and his partner Fran Walsh started talking about making an original fantasy film. But they couldn't think of anything that wasn't ripping off Tolkien, so they decided instead to look up the rights to Lord of the Rings. Zaentz still had them, and because Jackson was under contract with Miramax and the Weinsteins, who ran Miramax, he got Harvey Weinstein involved to secure the rights. Jackson knew it would have to be multiple movies, so at first he pitched one film based on The Hobbit, and if that was successful, he thought he would follow it up with 2 Lord of the Rings films shot back to back. Miramax was then able to secure the rights from Saul Zaentz, but they couldn't wrangle The Hobbit from United Artists, so instead they just focused on The Lord of the Rings. Jackson pitched 3 films, but the Weinsteins didn't want to take the risk, so they agreed on making 2 movies with a budget of $75 million. The Weinsteins apparently wanted Daniel Day-Lewis for Aragorn and Morgan Freeman for Gandalf. So in 1997, Jackson went off with Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Stephen Sinclair to start writing the scripts. It took them 14 months to write the 2 screenplays, which were 147 and 144 pages respectively. The initial scripts had a number of different scenes and story beats. For example, Gandalf was more frail and had given up pipe smoking. Gimli cursed a bunch. Oh, and also Aragorn and Arwen had a sex scene in the glittering pools in the second movie. So after reading the scripts, Miramax was concerned about the budget and they suggested killing off one of the 4 hobbits. And so yeah, it looked like these movies would actually cost probably about $150 million total. So Miramax went to its corporate owner Disney and asked for help with the funding. But CEO Michael Eisner was trying to cut costs at the time and turn them down. The Weinsteins then pushed back on Peter Jackson and demanded he cut the project down to just 1 movie, which he obviously didn't want to do, and this led to a lot of ugly back and forth about control of the project, but eventually Miramax allowed Jackson to shop the script elsewhere, just as long as Miramax was paid back for their investment and got 5% of the film's eventual revenue. Nearly every studio in town passed on Lord of the Rings, including Sony and Fox, but New Line CEO Robert Shea was a fan of the books, and so he took up the project, thanks to some funding from foreign distributors, and encouraged Peter Jackson to make it 3 movies instead of just 2. Quote, "Why would anyone want moviegoers to pay $18 when they might pay $27? So Jackson, Walsh, and Boyens rewrote the scripts with much more creative freedom. They chose not to line up the 3 films with the book's 3 volumes exactly, but instead saw it as a 3-part adaptation of the whole tome. Jackson took on a much more chronological approach to the story than Tolkien had in his original books. The filmmakers did a ton of research on the author, reading his letters and the books written about his works. They also spoke to the Tolkien estate, but the estate decided to distance itself from the movies. As early as August 1997, Jackson had hired the special effects house Weta Workshop, plus Tolkien illustrators Alan Lee and John Howe to get started on designing the film. Jackson wanted Middle-earth to feel real and almost historical. He cited Braveheart as an example. Weta made 48,000 pieces of armor, 11,000 real arrows, and 500 bows. They spent years linking plastic chainmail by hand. The special effects and production design teams also created 1,800 orc bodysuits, 10,000 orc heads, 1,800 pairs of hobbit feet, and they tried to make the creatures as biologically believable as possible. Shelob's body, for example, is based on an Australasian funnel web spider. Iggy Pop inspired the design of Gollum thanks to his skin-to-muscle ratio. In 2021, Elijah Wood said the orcs were designed to look like Harvey Weinstein. Set construction on location across New Zealand started a year before production to make sure that it all looked aged when it came time to shoot. Builders moved 180,000 cubic feet of earth to construct the Shire, for example. Peter Jackson, meanwhile, pre-visualized the effect sequences with miniatures and a lipstick camera. 40,000 toy soldiers were used to preconceive the battle scenes. Costume designer Ingela Dixon and 40 seamstresses created 19,000 costumes total for the 3 movies. John Rhys Davies' Gimli makeup took 4.5 hours to apply each day, by the way. As for the movie's cast, Jackson had wanted Ian Holm for Bilbo and Cate Blanchett for Galadriel from the beginning. New Line initially suggested Christopher Plummer or Sean Connery for Gandalf, and other names that were considered included Tom Baker, Tom Wilkinson, Sam Neill, Bernard Hill, Peter O'Toole, and Anthony Hopkins. Peter Jackson thought maybe Patrick Stewart could be Gandalf, but when he watched a tape of him acting alongside Ian McKellen, he preferred Ian McKellen, while Anthony Hopkins was later considered as a backup option for Bilbo Baggins. Christopher Lee was a die-hard Lord of the Rings fan, and is actually the movie's only cast member to have met the author, J.R. Tolkien. Lee wanted to be Gandalf so badly, he sent Jackson a photograph of himself in a wizard's costume, but Jackson would make him Saruman instead, beating out Jeremy Irons, Malcolm McDowell, and Tim Curry. Donald Sutherland and John Rhys Davies were considered for Denethor, but Jackson ultimately cast John Noble. Davies ended up playing Gimli instead, and for Boromir, they went out to Liam Neeson, but he declined. Then New Line suggested Nick Cage, but the filmmakers weren't into it, and so Sean Bean got the role. Lucy Lawless and Nicole Kidman were considered as backups for Galadriel, and Stuart Townsend was actually first cast as Aragorn, but within the first month of filming, the studio thought he was too young, so they approached Russell Crowe and offered him 10% of the movie's box office profit, which would have ended up being a $100 million payday for the actor, but Russell Crowe turned it down because he knew Peter Jackson didn't really want him in the movie. Jackson wanted Viggo Mortensen, who was called in just in time to film the Weathertop sequence. New Line gave Peter Jackson a budget of $281 million total for the 3 movies, which he shot back to back. Production began in New Zealand on October 11th, 1999, and lasted 438 working days total. Jackson initially wanted to shoot on 65mm film, but eventually settled for fine-grain Super 35mm. The movie shot on location across the country, as well as on sound stages in Wellington and Queenstown. And sometimes the crew was really out there in the New Zealand wilderness. The crew members often carried survival kits in case helicopters couldn't reach them to bring them back. Meanwhile, special effects miniature photography was happening at the same time over at Weta, except they called it Big-atures because these miniatures were quite large. The miniatures team worked more than any other crew on the movie, laboring over 900 days. The combined cast and crew swelled to 2,400 people at the height of production. The first scene that they ever shot was the wooded road sequence where the hobbits hide from a ring wraith under a tree. The Cirith Ungol stair ledge was built as a wet weather set on a squash court. Ian McKellen mostly shot with the Hobbit's scale doubles rather than the actual Hobbit actors, and he and Christopher Lee became good friends on set in the year 2000. There were some injuries while making the movie. Vito Morgensen broke his toe kicking an orc helmet, Orlando Bloom fell off his horse and broke a rib, and stuntman Brett Beatty dislocated his knee. The script was constantly being rewritten on the fly, and Sean Bean is famously looking down when he says his big line, "One does not simply walk into Mordor," because the script was on his lap. They had written that speech the night before, and he didn't have time to memorize it. Scale double sets and forced perspective were used to make the hobbits look smaller in frame. For the Council of Elrod scene, Gimli and the hobbits were filmed first, and then the human-sized characters were filmed in a second take, and the 2 shots were composited at different scales to make it look like the former group was smaller in the final image. Here's a little bit about Gollum. Weta began animating him digitally in 1998 as a proof of concept to New Line that they could pull it off. Originally, Gollum was going to be entirely CGI, but Peter Jackson loved Andy Serkis's audition tape so much, they brought him in to perform on set too. All of Andy Serkis's scenes were shot twice, with him in the frame and without him in the frame, with the intention that he'd be animated into the shot later. Serkis also did his scenes via motion capture suit for reference to the animators. In the end, the animators ended up using the scenes with Serkis in frame. They painted Serkis out and then animated Gollum in with his mocap performance as additional data for the animation. Each frame that included Gollum's skin in the shot took 4 hours to render. The Nazgul were performed by tall, slim actors wearing prosthetics and costumes. costumes, and many of these special effects were done by shooting the miniatures and then having the actors perform against green screen and then compositing the two shots. Principal photography wrapped on December 22nd, 2000. In total, Peter Jackson shot 6 million feet of film for the 3 movies, which is about 1,110 hours of footage. Each film got a full year of post-production time. Weta created a groundbreaking new digital effects tool called Massive software, which generated intelligent crowds for the battle scenes. Editing on the first film was relatively smooth. The second proved a little bit difficult because its story was more formless. Some scenes intended for movie 2 ended up in movie 3, and then editing on the third film was a bit chaotic. Jackson only saw the finished film the day before its Wellington premiere. Those 1,110 hours of footage were eventually edited down to 9 hours and 18 minutes for theaters. Howard Shore was hired to compose the trilogy's score. He created the most character leitmotifs, aka individual themes, in film history. The score is primarily played by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and famous artists like Enya, Renee Fleming, and Annie Lennox contributed their voices to the recordings. Peter Jackson also hit a gong for one measure in the second film. Similarly, Fran Walsh contributed to the Nazgul scream in the film's sound design, and the sound designers turned to a lot of natural audio for the sound of Middle-earth. The fell beast screech, for example, was a donkey bray, and 20,000 New Zealand cricket fans lent their voices for the sound of the Uruk-hai army in the Two Towers. Construction workers dropped massive stones for the sounds of boulders firing and landing in Return of the King. And then, the first trailer for the first film broke digital download records in 2000. The Fellowship of the Ring hit theaters on December 19th, 2001. It grossed $47.2 million domestic opening weekend, grossing $868 million total worldwide. The Two Towers was released December 18th, 2002. It grossed $62 million domestic opening weekend and did $923 million total worldwide. And then Return of the King hit December 17th, 2003, making $72.6 million opening weekend in the US, before going on to become the second movie ever to break $1 billion at the box office after Titanic. Return of the King grossed $1.1 billion total worldwide. When it was all said and done, the movies made $2.96 billion at the global box office off a $281 million budget. Critics loved every movie. Fellowship has a 92% off 236 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, Two Towers 95% off 258 reviews, and Return of the King 94% off 280 reviews. It is widely regarded as one of the best film trilogies ever made and has made dozens of best of lists. The 3 movies were nominated for 30 Oscars total, winning 17 of them. At the 76th Academy Awards, Return of the King won all 11 categories it was nominated in, including Best Picture. Those 11 wins set the record for the highest clean sweep in Oscar history, and tied the record for most Oscars won by a single movie alongside Ben-Hur and Titanic. The Lord of the Rings trilogy famously has extended versions available on home video, which total 11 hours and 23 minutes. By 2017, the movies had generated an additional $2.4 billion in home video revenue. Tolkien's world is still immensely popular across culture. Fans still travel to the film's sets and locations in New Zealand, and there have been more than a dozen Middle-earth video games since the movies came out. From 2012 to 2014, Peter Jackson would make another trilogy of films based on The Hobbit. The Hobbit movies cost a combined budget of $745 million, but they grossed nearly $3 billion at the box office, though they are widely considered inferior to his Lord of the Rings films. Amazon has released 2 seasons of a Middle-earth prequel series called The Rings of Power. An animated prequel film, The War of Rohirrim, is in theaters as of December 13th, 2024, and Peter Jackson is returning to produce 2 new live-action movies about Gollum, which will be directed by and star Andy Serkis. The first one is eyeing a 2026 release.